Well, it's good to be here today. Thank you guys for being here. Those of you joining us virtually as well. It's nice to be here on an anniversary, and I don't have the memories that many of you do of these past 64 years or however many you've been a part of the church, but I do have a lot of memories of Christ Community Church. My very first classis meeting was in September of 2010, and it was in this building, and at that classis meeting, I was examined for my ordination. So it happened in this building, and I've had the chance to be here for many other classis meetings. I was here one time with Mel, and I think Ed was there as well. We came out for a conversation for a little while when you were in between pastors. And so, I feel very grateful to be here with you to celebrate this moment with you. My church is actually celebrating their 10th anniversary this month. So I started thinking about that because we sort of began as a second service to some of the churches in the North Jersey area back in like 2009. So in some respects, we kind of thought, well, 2020 was our 10-year anniversary. But our first Sunday as a church plant in our own building was January 21st, 2012. So, or January 22nd, something around there. So anyway, we would technically be celebrating our 10-year anniversary this month too. So I'm not going to preach for very long on Psalm 78 because what I'm preaching on is the importance of reflection. But what we've seen already in this service today is the object lesson of the content of my sermon. And so I feel like even as we read Psalm 78 and I point out some things to us, we're going to say, well, we just saw that. That's what we're doing. We're doing and practicing the importance of reflection, and in particular, the reason it's important to the psalmist. So if you have a Bible, look at Psalm 78. I think it's going to be on the screen. I'm reading from the ESV, but here's what Psalm 78 verses 1 to 8 says. Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, but tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might, and the wonders that he has done. He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to teach to their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and arise and tell them to their children, so that they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and that they should not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God. The rest of Psalm 78, it's about 72 verses long. That's why I didn't read the whole thing this morning. I didn't know if we could handle it. But it's basically a retelling of Israel's history. And the long and short of it is that Israel was consistently rebellious and God was consistently faithful and patient. There's one verse I love towards the end, and I'm going to bring it up because it captures the way that the Israelite people saw God, but also the way that the Hebrews would write about God. If you remember the Old Testament story, the kingdom of Israel, followed by the kingdom of Judah, were taken into captivity by foreign nations because of their disobedience. And so the psalm doesn't shy away from this as a moment where they saw God move through foreign nations to essentially punish them, to bring them back to God. But for them, living in exile, it felt like God was silent or God was distant. And there have probably been times in this church where you've experienced those moments where it feels like, okay, maybe you're going through some challenging times, and it feels like, is God listening? Is God with us? And then this is what it says in verse 65. Then the Lord awoke as from sleep, like a strong man shouting because of wine. And he put his adversaries to rout. He put them to everlasting shame. Only the Hebrews would compare God to a drunk man. But that's what they do. They say this is how it was. He awoke with such energy and exuberance that it was like he had too much wine, and he put his enemies to everlasting shame. And that's sort of the message of Psalm 78, is that the only people who experience, God's everlasting silence is ultimately his enemies. But those who are his children receive his everlasting faithfulness. But what I really want to look at in sort of the context as we consider the importance of reflection is primarily this, that reflection is primarily for future generations. Why do we pause and reflect on what God has done? Well, the answer, according to the psalmist, is that it's primarily for future generations. Look how many times he says it. Verse 4, we will not hide these things from the children, but tell it to the coming generation. Verse 5, we will do what he commanded our fathers to teach to their children, that the next generation might know them. The children yet unborn would arise and tell them to their children. In other words, we tell our story and the story of our church so that our children would tell it to their children, and so that those children who are yet unborn would arise and would tell it to their children. The only person who knows what God has done in your generation is you. The only person who knows what God has done in your generation is you. If you are a parent, haven't there been moments, or weren't there moments, where you said, you have no idea what it was like when I was a kid? No idea. I mean, my kids, I could tell you, I could tell my kids what my life looked like in middle school. They're in middle. I have two boys that are in high school now, a daughter who's in 8th grade. And the things they complain about, like, why is Netflix not streaming on my phone? And you think if you had said that when I was in middle school, you'd have been committed to an insane asylum. None of those words made sense 25 years ago. There was no Netflix. It didn't stream. And certainly not to your phone, which was connected to a box on the wall in the kitchen. But what happens when it's important stuff, right? Like, why would they know that? But what happens when it's important stuff? I know a lot of people in our church and in our area have started small businesses, and now, or their parents started a small business and they took it over, and now they're getting ready to hand it off to their kids. And there's a frustration of, like, you don't understand what your grandfather, who was probably an immigrant, went through to start this company. They experience it now 2 generations later, and the company might be successful. A lot of family wealth has been generated. And now their kids, the 3rd generation, are taking over. And the parents are like, even though they're really thankful because it's this huge blessing that they can pass on, there's a part of them that thinks, but you have no idea. You have no idea what came before you. But how would they? They weren't there. They didn't live it. The children and the grandchildren in this church, they weren't here for the past 64 years. So how are they going to know? This is why reflection is so important for the future generations, because only you are the witnesses to what has occurred. Only you can give testimony to your past. And I think that what the psalmist is saying is that the reason that we must reflect on God and what he has done is because that's the only way that our children and their children and their children's children will ever hear this story. So what is it that we're reflecting to them? What is it that we're sharing? Well, if the reflection is for the future generations, I think there's 3 things that we need to reflect. Number 1, reflection needs to highlight the glorious deeds of God. Listen to this, what he says in verse 2-4. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, but tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders of all that he has done. The goal of reflection is to highlight what God has accomplished in our lives and in our generation. Now, unfortunately, our tendency, this is all of us, because we're humans, right? Our tendency is that when we recount the tales of the past, when we recount our history, we tend to want to make it a story about us and what we accomplished and what we did. That's part of the reason that when I'm telling my middle schoolers about what life was like when I was in middle school, I'm really centering it on myself. Well, you have no idea what I had to go through. You have no idea how hard it was for me. And for some reason, they don't just say, like, what was life like when you were a kid? I don't know where they got this from, but when my middle school and high school kids ask me about what life was like when I was growing up, they just say, back then. They just refer to the whole thing as back then. Back then, did you have cell phones? Like, back then, I'm not that old, but there's another way of telling those stories, right? There's a way of highlighting the way that God has worked. I can complain about my kids complaining about the fact that they have a computer in their pocket that's more powerful by far than the very first personal computer that I owned. And I could tell them that to share that with them. Well, you have no idea what it was like when I grew up, but really, what if I changed that story? Not from you have no idea, but what if I said, kids, have you ever considered how gracious our God is? That he has allowed us to be so connected with one another. That by his common grace in the world, he has used intelligent men and women to produce technology that, somebody said to me once, they said, when we read the scripture of Christ returning, it's kind of this idea that everybody's going to know at the same time, all over the world, that Jesus has come back. He was talking about it in the context of televisions, that there's so many screens everywhere. But right now, almost every person in the world, literally, developed nations, almost every person in the world has a cell phone within reach that you can get an instant notification the second something happens. A celebrity dies, bing, your news app notifies you. I mean, that's God's graciousness to us. Yeah, it's annoying when my kids complain about it. But there's a way of turning it around, isn't there? What about the technology that we have in churches that allows us through a pandemic to be able to connect with one another and pray with one another and share in worship services and have people sitting with us right now who are not in this room? There's a way of sharing what God has done in a way that gives God the glory. And if our children have it better than us, or if our children's future is going to be better than our future, what we hope for them, it's going to require that we tell them what God has done, not what we've done. Because there are times where I'm sure over the 64 years of our church, we could look at things that we have accomplished, things that we've done. We can look back on certain times as the golden days, or, probably some of you may remember when the building was built or purchased, or the money that was spent, or the changes that were made, or whatever. And you have these institutional memories of how things happened. But is it going to be about what you did or what God did? How are you going to frame that story? Now, here's the thing. Because one day, by the way, our hope is, and this is just starting to happen in my church. One day, God willing, it's going to be the kids of this church, the grandkids, that are on this stage leading worship. Like if James is here long enough, God willing, one day his son is going to be up here leading worship. Maybe when he's 14. Maybe he'll leave for a time, he'll go off, he'll go to seminary, and someday maybe, and he'll come back and maybe James's son will be the pastor of the church. Someday our kids and our grandkids are going to be the ones on this stage leading the church in worship, standing in this building, having had it passed down, having inherited it. And the only way that they will know how to carry that blessing is if they have been told the stories of what God has done. Not what you've done, but what God has done. See, there's a second part of this, because if you reflect on what you've done, here's something interesting that the psalmist says. If the first thing that our reflections have to do is give glory to God, the second thing that reflection allows us to do is ensure that we don't make the mistakes of the past. In fact, the psalmist might say, if you're going to talk about yourself at all, talk about your errors, not your successes. Talk about your errors so you avoid the pitfalls. He calls these things the dark sayings from of old. He says, I'm going to get real with you. I'm going to tell you what they did wrong. I'm going to tell you what happened. Now, I want to point to a tension here with our modern stories that we all struggle with. It's always easy for us to, with the benefit of hindsight, to point to previous generations and talk about what they did wrong. And I know that some of you get frustrated with that, living in the world that we live in, that, it's frustrating when a millennial talks about what the, generations before them did wrong when it comes to leading the country or whatever. It's frustrating. And you go, that's annoying to me. But on the flip side is we have to be willing to acknowledge mistakes of the past. And there's this tension that we have, because even though we can point out these things, we also don't want to be guilty by association. I'll give you an example of this that had happened within our own denomination several years back. There was a document that was put together that was looking into the way that Christian missionaries operated and acted at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. And what was happening around that time was that there was a surge in missionary and evangelistic efforts. And so missionaries from Europe and the United States would be going into these populations, tribal populations. In America, it was the indigenous people that they were trying to go reach. And so they would go with the intention of bringing the gospel to these people, and they did, and people were converted. But what often happened is as these missionaries went into those unreached areas, they didn't just bring the gospel. They also brought their entrenched culture. Like they didn't just bring the good news of Jesus and helped assimilate that and talk about how that fit within the context of the indigenous people, but they would also bring in Americanism or colonialism or Europeanism, so that you would go into a tribe in anywhere, an unreached nation, or like I said, an indigenous people, and you would effectively erase their native culture, because you wouldn't just bring the gospel, but you would also bring your Americanism or whatever. Now, the response to stories like that are usually one of two extremes. On the one side, you have people who are like, well, we all need to, it's like we want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We want to cast a pall on everything that those missionaries did, because there was this one aspect of it that we see now was really an unintended consequence of what was happening. But then there's the other side who says, oh, no, it's not our fault. We need to ignore it. Let's not talk about it, because maybe we're worried about what it might say about our missionaries or about our motives, or maybe even what it says about us or our motives. Unfortunately, the end result of those two kind of polarizing views is that we just never end up telling the story. And the reason that it matters, and the reason we have to tell stories like that, even when they're painful, is because if we don't, history will repeat itself. And in fact, right now, one of the things that we have to know and be aware of and wrestle with is that the number one theological persuasion doing missions in the developed world, in lower income impoverished nations, the number one theological strain doing missions in those areas is what we would call the prosperity gospel, or the health and wealth gospel. Something that, as Reformed people and Orthodox Christians, we would say we think that's heresy. It's the teaching that God, if you are faithful to God, God will always bless you with good health. He will always bless you with wealth. He will always be good, give you good earthly things if you are faithful. Well, you can imagine that message that portrays itself to be the gospel would be, if you were living in an impoverished nation and you were living in poverty, you would latch onto it. You say, that's great. I want to be faithful to God, because then I'll become wealthy. Then my kids won't die in childbirth. Then all these things God will give unto me if only I'm faithful. But of course, the problem is it's not true. That's not the way it works. Sometimes we get sick no matter how faithful you've been. Sometimes we lose everything no matter how faithful we are. And so, but what's happening is that this false gospel that's packaged up as the true gospel is going and spreading all over the world, because we don't want to tell the stories. We need to tell the stories, not out of shame, not out of guilt, but to acknowledge that if we don't recognize the mistakes of our own past, we will be prone to repeat them. And there's a good chance that those stories exist here in this church. They exist in our lives. They exist in mine. I could write a whole journal of things that I'm like, oh boy, I got to tell my kids that, so they don't repeat it. Why does that matter? Well, here's the final thing. Not just that we reflect God's glory and we reflect on our past mistakes so that we don't repeat them, but there's a third thing. Why does it matter that we portray our past that way, with God's glory and our mistakes, God's faithfulness and our rebelliousness? Because reflection gives us hope that God will be faithful in the future. Because reflection gives us hope that God will be faithful in the future. Verse 7, so that they, our children, our children's children, our unborn children who arise, so that they should set their hope in God and not forget the words of God, but keep his commandments. You see, if our whole history, if our reflection as individuals or as a church is always about what we did or the good things that we accomplished or how we were successful, then our children and our children's children and their children will be forced to live in our shadow. They will be forced to either trying to accomplish what we've done, or they will run from our shadow because they do not believe they have what it takes to do what we have done. They will be chasing us. It won't have been a story of God and how faithful he's been. It will be a story about us and how great we are, and that sort of story can only end in disaster. But if the past and the story that we tell when we reflect on what God has done at Christ Community Church, or the story that God has done in our own lives, if the story we tell is one of God's faithfulness towards us despite our stubbornness, in spite of our mistakes, then our children can go, no, I can live into that. That sort of God will be faithful to me. They will know that God will be faithful to them because he has always been faithful to us, and we have the stories to prove it. The reason our children will be faithful to God is because God will be faithful to them first. But they need to know that. They need to be told that. Our reflection needs to tell them that. That's the story that we pass down, a story that moves from generation to generation, a faith that passes from the parents to the children, to the grandchildren, to the great-grandchildren, and on and on and on. A story that is told when we reflect on what God has done, so that, as the psalmist says, the testimony of Jacob becomes our testimony too. You see, that's the power of reflection. That's the message of the gospel. Let me pray.